Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. My name is Zach Parrish. I'm the programming librarian here at the Bexley Public Library. Before we get started, I just want to steer everyone to our fall program guide. We have a bunch of wonderful programs going on this fall. So if you don't already have one, feel free to grab one from the back. And I also want to mention that we've added a couple author events that did not make it into the guide, but we are very excited to have Barbara Fant, who is a wonderful poet from Columbus. She's returning for part of her book release with Joy in the Belly of a Riot, and she'll be performing and talking to Hanif Abdur-Rakib. So that will be Tuesday, October 14th at 7 o'clock. And then we also have local author Sarah Gormley will be here on Tuesday, October 28th, celebrating the release of her memoir, The Order of Things, and that will also be at 7 o'clock. So you can pick up a bookmark, which are also on the back table. I also want to mention that this is a hybrid program tonight, so at the end of tonight's presentation, if you have any questions, please just raise your hand. We'll come around with the mic. That way those joining online will be able to hear what we are answering. And for those online, you can type your questions and comments into the chat at any time. All right, let's get into it. We are very lucky and excited to welcome Dr. Karen Lewis, who is an associate professor of architecture at The Ohio State University, whose research and teaching address how visual and information systems shape the architectural, territorial, and infrastructural space they create and inhabit. As Professor Dr. Lewis has expanded her research in the graphics and spatial complexity, turning her attention to the stories hidden within the archives. Professor Lewis's current research visualizes the Underground Railroad, providing critical counter-narratives through mapping, drawing, and writing in support of a forthcoming book proposal, Architecture of the Underground Railroad. And her research is currently on exhibit at OSU's Thompson Library. Was a cetacean soft launched, but will be on display through March 15th, 2026. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Lewis.
I really appreciate you bestowing honorific degrees upon me, but I do want everyone to know that I do have a Master of Architecture, which is a professional degree and not a doctorate. So just in case the friends online, and I certainly know my colleagues who do have PhDs, I want to honor the exceptional work that everybody offers. But so thank you all for coming here tonight, and thank you very much, Zach, for this really... Thank you. I can also see what I can do to project a little bit more, but the perfect timbre. Zach, I want to thank you very much for reaching out and inviting me to join this evening. There's a lot of people that I certainly want to thank, not least of whom friends and colleagues who are joining me in here from tonight. But I want to offer special thanks to The Ohio State University, in particular, the Battelle Endowment, and my grant collaborators, Dr. Hassan Jeffries, who may be joining us a little bit later, Professor Tamar Shute, Chris Strasbaugh, and Trayvon Park. Those are a couple of people who are really important to the development of this work that I received a grant from their support. I was also very lucky to be at the McDowell Artist Residency Program this summer, where I also worked on this project, so I want to thank McDowell. And of course, I have lots of colleagues that I do want to acknowledge, two of whom, John Davis and Thijs van Massakers, who were early collaborators in the thinking of this project. A slew of research assistants, and of course, all of the students who've ever participated in this work. It's really lovely to be here and kind of thinking about everybody today. So the talk that I'm going to share tonight is about the research that has gone into the exhibition that I've just opened at the Thompson Library, which is also titled, Was This a Station? And I wanted the title of the exhibition to be a question. Libraries should be filled with questions. And so the title of the exhibition, Was This a Station, not only puts inquiry on the table, but it also asks, it kind of puts all of the cards on the table right now. Was this building part of the Underground Railroad? The one that we have so diligently called a station. Was it actually a station? And while we're asking this question, what actually was an Underground Railroad branch? What was a road? What were the actors and the spaces that formed the Underground Railroad, and how did the Underground Railroad work? So how architecture was part of one's escape from enslavement to freedom is a question that I've been pursuing. And so as we dive into those questions, I want to begin with some local Ohio State history to situate our conversation tonight. So I like to think about this in 3 acts. The first act is going to be called The Underground Railroad on University Land. So how did this research begin? So in the fall of 2019, John and Tyus and I proposed a seminar about Ohio's Underground Railroad. And this began with 2 artifacts related to Ohio State. So the first is this map drawn by Wilbur Henry Siebert at the end of the 19th century. So like myself, Siebert was a professor at The Ohio State University, and in 1898, he published a book containing maps that depicted the first systemized vision of the routes enslaved people used to escape across the Ohio River and into the free North in Canada. Siebert spent decades of his career interviewing Black men and women who fled slavery throughout Ohio, as well as recorded accounts of the agents, nearly 3,000 white landowners, who sheltered fugitives in their homes. Though not the first recording of those who escaped slavery, that work was completed by a Black man from Philadelphia named William Still. Siebert's work is acknowledged as the first quote-unquote academic practice, and his research, questionnaires, letters, written notes, and interviews are digitized and preserved by the state archives. Siebert's map, though compelling and seemingly well documented and recorded, after all, Siebert's collected all of those testimonies through painstaking interviews for most of his career, they leave many stories untold, which is the criticism of his scholarship. Though he did tremendous work to collect those stories, he tended to overemphasize his white abolitionist colleagues and downplay the work of the Black men and women who were escaping slavery. So this painting I like to include when we think about this, which is often shared as an example of what the Underground Railroad was, painted by Charles T. Weber, currently owned by the Cincinnati Art Museum. This painting was exhibited at the Chicago World's Fair, which Siebert saw when he went and visited the Columbia Expo in 1893 during his first years of teaching at Ohio State. And the critique of this painting is that it really shows, it doesn't show the agency, activity, or ingenuity of the men and women who were escaping enslavement. It tends to prioritize the narrative from the point of view of people who owned land, owned houses, and were there to kind of help and guide and create the Underground Railroad. But that is a fallacy. Contemporary scholarship rejects that idea. Contemporary scholarship really emphasizes people who actually enacted their own escapes. So the second Ohio State artifact is a series of signs on campus that state a branch of the Underground Railroad moved through the area that is now where Ohio State is. These 5 little signs trace a path that begins at the Olentangy River and moves across campus, highlighting a low-lying area of campus where the now culverted Neal Run stream still runs. So the signage ends at the Ohio Union, but the story, kind of itinerary, continues the path across the street to High Street, and across High Street, ending at the original Neal family homestead. William Neal built this Swiss-style home for his son Robert in 1856. The home on the hill, as it was known, was renamed Indianola by William's youngest son, Captain Henry Neal. An early enlister in the Union Army, Henry was wounded during the 1862 Battle of Iuka near Indianola, Mississippi. So a lot of names have probably already rung some bells, right? Indianola, Iuka. After the war, Henry took ownership of this brick house. Now, eventually, the house was passed to the Kappa Sigma fraternity. And in 1919, the fraternity went from living and assembling in this Swiss-style house and undergoes an overhaul renovation that encompasses the Neal home in the Virginia colonial style, designed to reflect the fraternity's heritage. That was well timed. I think I hit the click button and then it was like, doo-doo. So anyway, so after this seminar, staring at the signs, staring at the buildings, and not feeling like we've really gotten into the meat of the research that we wanted to start to see. So as my colleagues and I were wrapping up the semester, I wanted to learn more about the Underground Railroad on campus, the Neal House, and the Sieber Archive. So 3 absolutely wonderful undergraduate students joined me in the beginning of a closer examination on these topics. And so this is kind of an overview of the Miro board. This is a technology that we use that holds questions and notes and images. So our question that we really sort of formulated around was, can we expand our understanding of the Underground Railroad by researching the histories of the people, architecture, landscapes, and infrastructure described on the campus markers? So let's begin with these artifacts that we see. And so we had a couple of questions here that were guiding us. We broke into 3 different teams. Each student took on a different question. The first one, which is, what is the history of the campus underground signage? So we had questions about, who's responsible for the signage? What documentation does OSU have to support the stories that are being presented? And what has OSU published about this project? Another student took on the question of who were the Neal family? And what did their house play in the Underground Railroad? So asking further questions there, does the Sieber Archive connect to the stories of the Neals at all? Or what information does Kappa Sigma have in their archives? What other information? And then finally, we also were asking, can we locate the routes and the landmarks of the Underground Railroad in the space through its prominent components? So can we look for things like the Olentangy River or sycamore trees or some of these things that were sort of given to us on that itinerary that the signage supposes? So as we kind of started to untangle and walk through this work with a lot more sort of precision, during this closer investigation, we learned several important things. So the first is, in taking a closer look at the history described on the signs, we realized that the stories that were being told were not always about the places or the people where the signage was located. But rather, as an example of the second sign, describing things that happened in entirely other locations. And so I just want you to think about that for a second. Usually when we go and we see a commemorative marker, it's like, here stood Paul Revere, or here was this thing that happened on this date in this place. There's a sign that starts to talk about things that were happening 100 miles away. The narrative here describes the work of John Rankin and John Parker, who are abolitionists who worked in Ripley, Ohio, which is about 100 miles away along the Ohio River. Now, the signage claims that these men directed freedom seekers to the Scioto River. However, I can't find any mention of the Scioto or the Olentangy River in any of the sources that we were talking about. So we started by just kind of like, let's pull apart the things that we just for sure are not certain about. But we can't also find any mention of the Neal Run as being part of the Underground Railroad or of any sycamore trees. So while the rest of the information on this sign is factually accurate, there is a leap of imagination to thread the Olentangy and the Neal Run into the story, which puzzled me and asked me to think about why these signs are located here, why these stories are being told on university land. So why is Ohio State holding these stories? The second sort of conundrum is the way that the signs were describing the Underground Railroad. And as I mentioned, a lot of contemporary scholarship really takes the Underground Railroad out of the expectation that there was a house that someone could come into and they would be sheltered and they would maybe be hidden. But actually it was an itinerary and a journey that was much more spontaneous and much more difficult. So some of the things that are being said, following streams to houses or directing escapees to other rivers or trees or signs along the way, did not align with the firsthand experiences that we were reading, and they were not aligning with what contemporary scholarship typically offers. So this image from part of an exhibition that I did at the Newberry Library held this thesis that the Underground Railroad wasn't just safe houses coordinated by white abolitionists, but rather a series of unpredictable routes, landscapes, structures, and spaces spontaneously invented by the Black men and women seeking liberation. Which leads to the third realization, and the one that has motivated a lot of the exhibition and the talk that I'm going to share with you, which is how the Neal House plays into this story. So the Kappa Sigma fraternity once stated on its website, they have since taken it down, that the story of their house is muddled, but speculations have been made. Indianola was said to be used as an Underground Railroad station by use of hidden tunnels in the house. So the house's reputation as a station is given further credence by a palette of what I call mysterious pochés. There's secret panels, non-architectural walls, tunnels, hidden rooms, secret passages, all described across decades of sources. Most recently, this summer, the Columbus Metro Library posted on their Instagram page that like, oh, this was an Underground Railroad and there were tunnels underneath it. And I commented, I was like, no, there weren't. And they wrote back and they was like, okay, let's start thinking about how we tell these stories. And so what I thought was really fantastic about that was that they were thinking about how institutions can change and understand scholarship in new ways as they learn and grow, which I think is so wonderful to have that in the library. So one of the strangest and the most confident speculations asserting that the house was a station is a claim that a tunnel extends from the Olentangy River all the way to the Neal House. So over and over again, articles recite the presence of this tunnel that begins in the furnace room and which reportedly at one time ran all the way to the Olentangy, serving as a means of smuggling people from the river to the house. The tunnel is now blocked off, but winter months reveal its path, the snow tending to melt far more quickly on the roof of the underground passage than on the surrounding areas, end quote. So this rather dubious statement first appeared in The Lantern, which is a student newspaper at OSU in 1957, but has been carried forward so many times across many sources, across many institutions, and even quite recently. And while the idea that an Underground Railroad station should have an underground tunnel, there's this idea that aside from questions about who would have been building a mile-long infrastructure in 1856, the last paternalistic idea that men and women escaping slavery made it hundreds of miles all the way into Ohio, and through so many impossible threats to at long last reach the Neal Run, that safety would be provided by an underground tunnel owned and operated by the Neal family, undermines the agency and ingenuity of those who are actually escaping slavery. So what does all of this mean? So I began this question, can we expand our understanding of the Underground Railroad by researching the stories that were present on those signs or maybe in the archives? Can we find out more? And instead of gaining clarity, as I fully expected that I would, I seem to have walked into a more confusing territory. So what are those crevices? And what are those strange spaces within the Neal House? And are they even there? And if there wasn't a tunnel, perhaps was there something else? Are people misunderstanding something that isn't actually a tunnel? And what about the Neal Run? How does this connect to that larger story? And why is Ohio State, again, why is Ohio State telling the story? So I didn't have any answers to these questions, but I knew the next step. And the next step was to take a tour of the Kappa Sigma fraternity. So that brings us to Arc 2, which is investigating the architecture of the house. So in July 2022, Walt Schuler and Tim Krieger, two Kappa Sigma alumni and very generous tour guides, offered to bring me to the given overview of the Kappa Sigma house and show me the spaces that have been identified as being part of the Underground Railroad over many years. Walt and Tim were incredibly generous with their time. They, even before I came to tour the house, they went ahead and opened up all of the doors for all of the closets so that we could take a look at many things. So you can see that down here in the weight room, all of those doors are opened in preparation for our investigation. And you can see like the spaces, you see these strange kind of mysterious seeming foundation walls. A lot of things are rotting. There's not a lot of care being kept to the overall infrastructure of the house, which was interesting to experience. But the first space that is commonly identified is in the basement. And it is a strange little square room made by thick foundation walls. And you can see here, Walt in purple, Tim is sticking his head into that space. This is the furnace room and the washers and dryers that are down here, where the brothers have been excavating and looking for the Underground Railroad for many decades. So you may remember this photo that was shown in 1967 from the dispatch that I showed earlier, and this is where one of their members are sticking their head out of the hole. And when I shared this information with the alumni from Kappa Sigma, one of them raised their hands and they were like, "Oh, I know James, the guy in the photo, and yeah, I remember, I was there that day, and we were telling the reporter, no, this isn't part of that, but the reporter was like, well, let's just get a photo of you." So already there's like all of this sort of enthusiasm tied into this. Here is that space that Walt is illuminating for us. So the bottom there we see with the dirt floor and the old foundation walls, and then looking up. So when you look at this in the plans of the buildings, and I recognize not everybody is fully adept at reading plans, so let me share with you a little bit. Actually, do we have a pointer, out of curiosity? I have a automation, but also a pointer. Thank you. That would be really, really helpful. So the bottom button, right? So this little room right here, with the now broken-in door, that is what's known as the Underground Railroad space. So that's down there in the basement. It is a very strange space. It sort of travels up, if you will, through the first floor. So if you think about what's right below us when we're standing on the first floor, so here you walk in, you come up the steps, you walk in the front door, there's a foyer, then you're in this entryway before you're in the corridor, and this room, which I will show you in just a second. But that space is happening right below your feet. Here's that space on the opposite side. Well, actually, let me go back. So the space, hold on, now my animation has thrown me off. Okay, we're in the basement now, and now we're in the first floor. And that space is right here behind the chimney and the fireplace. So my first thought when we were studying this is I was like, okay, maybe this space has something to do with the infrastructure of the chimney, maybe it has ash debris, maybe it has some sort of other kinds of configurations. As we move up the Kappa Sigma house from the first floor up all the way to the third floor, the brothers were then able to show me another space that's been identified as the Underground Railroad up all the way on the third floor. So from the basement all the way to the top of the house. And that space is right here along this corridor. And this corridor, the long, skinny corridor, there you can see Tim is showing us, here's the corridor, there we are. Then we're in this room looking out that window. So Tim and Walt were looking here. So that's kind of how we're orienting ourselves inside of that space, yes. And just to remind you of how that space relates to the other parts of the spaces in the building, that's that round window that we were just standing in, and then there's that little hallway right next to it. So it's kind of tucked up in the pediment of the new presentation of the building. So just to refresh our memories, what I want you to pay attention to is this wall over here on the right, that red wall. So you can see that roof is sliding down, and on the other side of that red wall, there's a cavity. So here we can see it in plan. That wall in red, I'm highlighting for you there. And then that other space there, it's not an occupied space, but it's just this sort of sloped space, an attic space, underneath the eaves of the new build. And when we crawl through and take off this panel and we go through the closet and we're in that space, this is the second space that has been identified as the Underground Railroad. So this was very strange, right? We have a space in the basement and a space in the attic, which highlights some of those tropes that we typically hear about people being hidden or the building itself is absorbing its freedom seekers. But in fact, that's not at all how the Underground Railroad operated. I know. And I thought very carefully about updating this sign, but this is factual. So this is from that hallway, looking through the closet. When you remove that caution panel, you crawl underneath it. Now, I did this, my friends. I did this, and it was terrifying. There is not really a floor. I did not take photos because I was like, I get it. And I really didn't want to be distracted. But when I walked into that space between up here on that roof pediment, right? And I'm going to highlight that for us. So I'm in that space of the building. You can see the facade of the Swiss house that still remains on the inside. You can see the chimney coming down. And it is a complex space of many layers of renovations. So when we remember the square space down below, we can see how it kind of lines up with that chimney, right? So there's this kind of thick area that's being identified as Underground Railroad. And that's the part where we want to kind of spend some more of our time thinking. Which brings me to the third act, mapping the house across time. I was incredibly lucky. The following fall, I had an incredible discovery. I was able to find the 1918 renovation blueprints by architect Ray Sims, which was located in the Ohio History Connection Archive. So a shout out to the Ohio History Connection Archive. If you haven't been, it's a really beautiful space and a wonderful institution whose CEO is sitting here with us today. In part of my research, it was pure luck that I was able to make this connection, that somewhere in my earlier research, I learned the name of an architect somewhere that was named Caldwell. And for those of you that know Schooley Caldwell, the architecture firm here in town, I was like, I wonder, what their history is. I bet there has something to do with it. And so I did a quick search, and I was like, okay, they have some deep history. They've been practicing architecture in Columbus for a long time. Let me reach out. So I reached out to the firm principals to ask them what they knew of the house, and they put me in touch with their archivist, who then confirmed that, yes, it was Ray Sims who did the architecture for the renovation, not the original. And an early partner in the firm, and he had worked on this house and provided me with the information of what exactly I needed to see. So I ended up going back to the archive and finding these blueprints. So also earlier in my research, there was mention over and over again of a northern addition made to the Swiss house. Now, I had always assumed that the Swiss house was this original entire footprint. And this is the as-built from 1918. This is the renovation, where you can see they've made the boiler room, right? So that's a furnace. There's our square space. There's our mysterious square space. So there are those two spaces there. Now, I always assumed that the entire building was this part that was as-built, right? That was the original. Now, of course, I'm looking at the lantern and I'm being very dubious of things that are being presented in these maybe more creative reportings. of what the Neal House was, but they did mention a couple of times in a few other sources, there was this tiny little mention of a northern addition, an addition happening, a structural improvement happening in the late 1890s. So, as I mentioned, I always thought that this whole thing was the original. But what I started to realize that this was actually the northern wing right here is the hypothesis of what was added. And you can see it kind of peeking over here, and this was the northern wing. So when I go back to these blueprints, I was looking at this and I'm like, okay, how, northern wing? How do you add a northern wing? Then I realized that the first house highlighted here in white, that's the original. That was the first Swiss house, completely symmetrical. Then the northern wing was added. Now we can start to see the beginnings of that funny space. Now, I don't know for sure how this happened, but my guess as an architect is they simply closed off that foundation. And they closed off that foundation in order to provide more support for the other additions and the kind of oriels and the different windows that they were going to add above. And so when I start to see how that building was grown and changed and articulated over time, what starts to also emerge is a fascinating story about how we misinterpret architecture. So to verify and kind of test my hypothesis, not just to look at the documentation and use my skills and my degree as an architect to say, I herefore say that these foundations were built in the following way. It logically makes sense to me. But then I found another piece of information that I had been staring at for months. And this is the 1872 Caldwell map of Columbus. Now, for those of you that have seen this before, what's fascinating about this very early phase of the agricultural college grounds, which was now becomes the Ohio State University, we have the Olentangy River, we have the Neal Run moving across the campus, we have the original University Hall, and then we have this building right here. So even in the maps, there's this imagination of the Neal House, the Neal Run, and the Olentangy River and the campus sort of being tied together and presented and imaged for us in 1872. What was satisfying about this, not just for drawing those connections, but what was satisfying about this was to see on this floor plan or in this map, the house is perfectly symmetrical. After the Civil War, the house is perfectly symmetrical. So that was satisfying. So as we start to look at the house, we realize that the house doesn't begin here, it begins over here, in the 1856 symmetrical Swiss house. Then we move into the 1898 Swiss northern wing, and I'm labeling these because otherwise we were getting very confused in our own team research. I'm like, what are we talking about, the original, or is it the first original or the second original? And so we were like, okay, it's Swiss A, Swiss B, Virginia, and the 70s. So in blue is the Virginia neoclassical, so the update, the kind of dress that gets put around the house, and then additional updates that were happening to the house. So in articulating these eras, right, this is what we also started to call this the eras tour. We were getting very excited about the different ways that we were thinking about this building. We modeled the sort of pieces of the building over time. So we wanted to show, okay, white is going to be what was there in 1856, then green, then blue, and then orange, and you can start to peel back the layers of time. And so by developing this, and here's like a part of the basement. So here's our famous room, which we drew that little hole just to kind of help give us that sort of texture. You can see that the basement of the house is like a book, an archive in and of itself of all of these decisions that have been made over a century. And it's fascinating, and it's really strange. And can you imagine your own house that you've lived in, if like every 50 years there were some new walls that were put up, or things that were closed, or new kind of spaces that were subdivided, and you kept that. So it's fascinating to look at the building as a record of all of these decisions. Here's another version, and this is a more complex but a kind of good advertising image of the house, the axon of the basement with the subsequent layers kind of moving up above and each one pulled apart, sort of like a anatomical illustration of the house. So luckily enough, we thought to take a couple of photos of this model before we built the rest of it, and so here you can see all of those different walls and different colors of different eras over time. And cutting away at the house. So we're kind of taking a cake slice out of the house. So we're taking a chunk of the house and then we took a slice out of the center of it. Because up here on the 3rd floor, which is where that closet is, you can also now see where all these layers of time are starting to collapse with one another. So you have the renovations from the 70s, you have the mint green leftovers from the Northern Edition, you can see beyond to the original white, and then the blue Virginia wrapper that starts to happen. So here's a few more of those where you can like look down and like really look into it and see it. What's very peculiar and fascinating is that whenever you have multiple eras coming together, that is what gets described as the Underground Railroad. So it's not when you have Swiss and Virginia, like back here. It's not when you have the northern side and the blue side put together. Well, that's loaded, that statement, right? But it's when you have all of the colors, all of the time coming together, that immediately seems to capture imagination and identification of being the Underground Railroad. So here you can see those two drawings again. So looking down, there's that little square room. We're kind of looking down into it. So this is that cake slice out of the back. And then here it is in its current installation at the Thompson Library, where we have the roof lifted up off of it so you can look down into it. And students who are being well educated, learning about the Underground Railroad as they observe. So the other model that we wanted to show was one that really kind of talked about the exterior wrapping. And this is where I started with the work. I was like, okay, it's a house that's become this other house, but it's just gotten a wrapper around it. It's like a house that's been wrapped in another house. And somehow that misread between the two is what's causing all of this commotion. So just to kind of help guide you along too, the solid white 3D print, this is our 1856, 1858 Swiss house. Then that translucent blue plexiglass, that's the 1919 Virginia house. So you can see that they just kind of tacked this on. And then the translucent orange is the 1970s edition. Now, I didn't put the northern wing on the model at this time because I didn't know it was there. I assumed that everything that was white was the original, but then I learned. Also, in clear plexiglass, right? So you can see here, it's a little difficult to see, but the clear plexi chimneys, and then this window, and then this like Swiss balcony, and these little things, those were all removed. So clear shows what was removed in order to create this presentation of Virginia. So there you can see the house now. As it starts to wrap, you can kind of see the ghost of the Swiss house inside of the Virginia house. Now, in this more complete version of the model that we did, we showed where the Underground Railroad was by adding this green hatch. And this is why I've kind of been using green throughout the story tonight to kind of show where that was. So we have, of course, the basement room, but we also have a couple of these other little spots, including this spot down here in the ground, which I will get to in just a second. And then this is an earlier version, but just to kind of fully put the three-dimensional picture together. This is in my office, me just holding my phone, but there's that square room that becomes this structural system moving up through the house. To kind of locate and hold that new foundation that was kind of being brought forward. So in the blue plexiglass model that you can see in Thompson, you can look into the basement and you see that corner there, which is this corner right here, sticking in. So this is the furnace room, this is the laundry, this is where Walt would be standing right there at that moment. And so you see that through time. And then turning around in the back of the house, looking through the roof and the addition and looking back deep into the rest of the building. Now, one thing that we found during this that was incredibly satisfying, I'll speak to this, this is part of the case that's currently on display, is that the house is here, and then we have the blueprints kind of extending from this blue lawn, if you will, to kind of present this. And something that I found that I was extremely excited about was in looking at the original blueprints, I found that there was also a site plan that had regraded the front lawn. So all of these numbers here are all different changes in elevations that the architects were asking to transform during that 1918 transition. And if anybody knows anything about this kind of Virginia colonial Kappa Sigma, they were originated at the University of Virginia. And if anybody has ever been to the University of Virginia, that great sweeping Jeffersonian lawn, you can't have a neoclassical Virginia building without that sweeping lawn. And these are two photos. This is my father down below. These are my nephews. We were recreating that. The house on the hill, you can see here that hill, which has had its own narratives associated with it. But the house on the hill was not going to work with the Virginia colonial, so they had to represent that. So as we think about all of these layers, we think about what does it mean to change a building? What does it mean to have the representations of the Underground Railroad? These start to show up in all sorts of different ways across campus. The Union has even been designed as part of the Underground Railroad, or to reference the Underground Railroad. We have images, and I'll go through this one more time. So we have the signs, right? We have the Neil Run. That's something that's very important to this story. Then way back in 1926, in the yearbook, there was this image of John Rankin's house, which is part of the Underground Railroad, and his very famous 100 Stairs gets captured over here. And we have all of this imagery, and we have all of this iconography, and we have all of this belief that the institution is holding on to. So what does this all mean? So one of the questions that I want us to think about tonight is, first of all, there's lots of ways to think about the Underground Railroad, and it gets very complicated very quickly. We also did thermal imaging, which is a whole other part of the story, but we'll get to that. How much has been spawned off, or how much has been spun off as a result of misunderstanding architecture? If this wasn't a station, what does that do to all those other narratives? How do all the rest of the pieces that we believe and we hold on to very dearly, how does that start to change? If it's no longer about the building that's holding up that identity, then what is it? What do we point to? What do we hold on to? And so as we kind of think about that for the end of our session tonight, I wanted to thank everybody again for having me, but to open up some of those questions about what is the what is the Underground Railroad imaginary? Why is it important to us today? Or why was it important to us in 1957 when it first showed up on campus? Or maybe even in 1926 when it somehow first showed up in the yearbooks? Why has that happened? And what does it mean to call a building a part of the Underground Railroad when we know that the Underground Railroad was made by the ingenuity and brilliance of the men and women who were enacting their own escapes from enslavement? Thank you all so much.
Well, yeah, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I just had, I guess, a comment and a question. Your research reminds me of the incredible book, How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith, where he visits different places that have a history of slavery and kind of sees how they're grappling with that history today and how accurate it is. Yeah, I guess you pose that big question at the end, but to you as someone who's doing this research, how do you yeah, I guess, how do you feel about like the importance of being accurate and then telling the true story of this, the history of the house, and then how, yeah, again with your story, how do we accurately tell those stories and highlight those individuals who made these heroic journeys without kind of building an imaginary story because it is interesting to where we're at or something like that. I don't know. It just reminded me of how in Clint Smith's research, some stories were being as accurate as possible, where others were not addressing it at all, and in some cases they were maybe not staying true to the facts, but it meant something to that local history, so they were carrying that torch a little bit as well. Yeah.
I mean, in some way, I've heard people say the word "the truth" when referring to this work, and I hold that word very, very lightly. Because I'm entirely convinced that we may learn something else, very shortly that changes the way that we're understanding this. So my first thought is, how do we stay brave in order to keep our interpretation and our understanding of things open and flexible as we change? The book about how the word was passed is really about something that actually happened, right? This is enslavement happening in these locations, and this is how institutions are telling that story. This is a little different from that, right? Which I think is a fair thing to bring up, because somebody was like, oh, you've got to read that book. And I'm like, this is gonna be great. And I'm like, this is something really different. This is more like in the wake. This is anti-racist books that are talking about how the history of enslavement still persists today, without question, absolutely. What this is about is, and I hesitate to even call it because there are some really brilliant public scholars in this room, but I think what this is about a wish. It's maybe even about like, oh, that was a good thing. We're going to associate ourselves with that good thing. But the other part of it is that when you're telling a very abstract story that doesn't have a lot of physical evidence, like the Underground Railroad, the artifacts that remain are most often the buildings, the homes of the abolitionists or the churches of the abolitionists who had that history of wealth or were able to preserve that building for a long period of time. Because there are a lot of activities, a lot of people, especially in Ironton, Ohio, there's huge amounts of Underground Railroad activity that were held and shepherded by Black communities, that those buildings just were not preserved. So in some ways, it also maybe asks a question for me, like, what do we choose to hold on to? What buildings are we going to save versus not save? Or how do we hold on to those even if they're not built in a way to be sustained over many, many years, but there are other ways that we can have that. So those are things that I think about, which I know many of you in the audience do as well.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Lewis. I was curious, have you faced any resistance from OSU or any institutions in Ohio in conducting your research and challenging this narrative they love to project? No. I've received a lot of enthusiasm, which I think is interesting, although maybe the resistance is coming. I'm looking at my partner in crime. He's like, oh, honey, the resistance is coming. No, I think that so far I haven't. But like I said, I'm open to possibilities that things may change. Like we may get some information that changes very quickly. But for the most part, the institution has been curious. And when I say the institution, that's hard to say because it's really a select group of people that I've been talking to. But the people that we're talking to, the group that installed the signs are aware of the research that I've been doing. And I want to be careful
not to ever say to somebody like, shame on you, you did this thing that you thought was really important, but you're actually perpetuating something that is harmful or maybe not like something difficult. Because everyone's operating under the best assumptions that they have at that time. And without a doubt, right, there may be information that comes into all of our lives that changes the way that we interpret this yet again. So, so that's not a very satisfying answer. But no, that resistance has not shown up exactly yet. I've received resistance about this project in other ways, but not from the campus itself. But I would love to hear if others have.
You mentioned that like CML engaged with your comment. Has OSU like considered revisiting the signage to be more accurate?
I know. Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you for the wonderful talk, Karen. One question I have is, can you just speculate on what you think the agenda might have been to commemorate these things, and even the fraternity? Like, why would they want to do this? So it's clear the journalists from the 1957 article, they want to sell papers, they want to sell a story, but what's the agenda of the fraternity and others to sell a particular narrative?
That is a beautiful question. When I look at the words of Carmen, Ohio, which is the Ohio State University song, there's a phrase in there that talks about honor and perseverance and justice, or there's something that's like how firm thy friendship, forgetting exactly what it is, those of you that know Carmen, Ohio, but there's a phrase in there that sometimes I take as a way of criticizing why these signs are here. That is an oversimplification that puts the institution into good stead. So I think there are a lot of different, because the signs say some very different things. Like there's one sign that talks about the Board of Trustees, which is like, why are we talking about the Board of Trustees? But okay. And then there's another sign that talks about the Neal family, and then there's another sign that talks about things that are happening in Ripley, and then there's another sign over here. And so it's a melange of things. So maybe it's like a Christmas tree of putting the ornaments on of what these things are that we want to make sure that we're maybe standing on the right side of history about. Especially, and they do on the signs mention Ohio's Black Laws from 1850, but they sort of catch it in saying like, well, even though it was, you know, you had the right to come kidnap your property in the state of Ohio, we still have a lot to be proud of. And so there's a lot in there that it's like there's a couching of the activity. So I think the hope there, or the maybe what people were trying to tell or say, was some version of fascination. I think the fraternity is interested in something that's maybe fascinating or unique, or maybe absolves them from something. I don't know. But we can speculate. That's probably a whole other chapter to think about. So, yeah. I would be very curious what your speculations are, that we can talk about at some point when we've all had time to marinate. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, yes.
Does that Neal run, that walk, is on that little spring river, is that still in existence?
It is. Culverted, yes, which means it's underground. It is what currently, yes, it does still exist. I've had some colleagues in the landscape department that have gone and like filmed or did a sound test, like dropped microphones down like sewers, and you can hear the water running. It's what feeds Mirror Lake. I mean, I don't think it's a robust rolling stream. That's like anything like that. It's more of a trace, but it was very important to the founding of Ohio State because Ohio State had fresh water, which would be an important reason to place the university in its location. So there's another aspect of the talk where we talk about the relationship of campus to the Neil Run, and then the Neil Run being tagged onto the Underground Railroad and having this kind of reciprocal imagination. So the founding identity of the campus is somehow then gets tied into this belief system of how the Underground Railroad operated. Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Is there some movement in the state of Ohio that the legislation is trying to give recognition to the Underground Railroad as some kind of formal Ohio thing? Seriously.
So the National Park Service has done an amazing job of identifying the network to freedom, but I might also look to my friend and colleague, Megan. No, you're like, oh, no.
I think there's a day, there's like a day of remembrance that it happens a weird time, like October or something. Or maybe, yeah, maybe. But that's probably as far as it goes, outside of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Set, which isn't necessarily a state thing, right?
Yeah, thank you. But there is recognition of this in lots of different ways. And sometimes the recognition comes from, like last year when I attended the National Underground Railroad kind of convening at the Ohio History Connection. There was a man who spoke about his family's history and the work that they did over a very, very long period of time to receive recognition and to get a commemorative, like a marker placed. And then simultaneously, I'm also received an inquiry from an organization that wanted help, but their interpretation of the Underground Railroad was misty, to say the very least. So lots of people are wanting to recognize and think about, and it's a very complex topic. So it's hard to know how and where to do that. So.
Said about how libraries should contain questions. I was curious if you could elaborate on some of the other design decisions that went behind the installation process at Thompson.
Yeah, so some of the design decisions were about curating a story in particular ways. So like we had certain artifacts on one side versus another in order to hold some of those narrative questions. So what object do you put next to what is a really big part of exhibition design. But in terms of like, are you asking like design decisions? I feel like there's more inside of that.
I guess how did you decide to tell the narrative of your research to the public in this particular format?
I'm an architect, I build models. Like when I looked at this, I was like, this is a model, this is a diagram, this is a map. There's lots of ways that we can articulate this. And then with the Betha grant, the grant that I got with the collaborators that were part of the grant became an excellent moment to have the library at the center. You know, one of my collaborators were there and it was like, yeah, let's do something in those cases so that we can have that. And then we can build other programming around. So it was a kind of luck of affiliation, but also building models seemed like a really good thing to put into a three-dimensional experience. Yeah. Sorry.
Do you see your research continuing? I guess it's a two-part question. Do you see your research continuing, or is this kind of concluding it? And I'm also thinking that if I had a residence that had a mythology around it, being part of the Underground Railroad, I might hear you speak tonight and think, I would love for you or someone to come. Can you prove or disprove? Is there fact to it? It sparks a lot of questions for me as I think about different places I've visited that have proclaimed to be part of it. Are they in fact, were they part of it? And now I'm kind of curious if there might not be.
So that's beautiful questions. Thank you. Is this work continuing? I really was I want to get through tonight, and then, and then we're like, thank you for that, but I'm looking forward to having a breath. It's been a very busy summer. Ask me in another week. Yes, exactly how some of this stuff is getting wrapped up. But the first part of this began, I gave one of the first public presentations about this to the Society of Architectural Historians. And so architectural historians, you'd think, would be an audience that would really have a lot to say about the authenticity of architecture. Every single one of them was like, oh, I know a building and it has a tunnel. Every single one. And I guarantee a lot of you are sitting here in the audience right now. And it started, I mean, when I was in Connecticut on a Girl Scout tour of this colonial house, they opened the basement door and they were like, that's the Underground Railroad. And I, of course, am looking for like Metro North. I'm thinking like, is that where we go to Grand Central? Like, what's happening? So I know my own literal 6-year-old mind, but it's fascinating to me. Like, and I, over and over again, even at McDowell this summer, tunnels under the city or this hundering up of that. And as we know, very, very few tunnels were involved at all. Yeah. And it gets complicated too because there's a group that I've had some affiliation with, the Fairfield Archaeological Association in Gloucester County, Virginia. They have done work with a church, blanking on the name, but there are these beliefs of there are tunnels. And this is a Black church, a Black community, and have very, very proud feelings of this because of the underground tunnels are really a big part of that narrative. So it's really hard to say, like, you don't want to come up and take something away. For some reason, it feels maybe easier to take something away from someone that's a private property. It's harder when it's a public community property. I'm gonna have to chew on that. That's a good question. Yeah.
I know you said you want to like take a break after tonight, but I'm curious if there's any plans for programming with the exhibition, or like how people can get a firsthand look at like when they can visit Thompson Library.
You can go visit Thompson Library anytime that it's open. It's there. You can come take a look at it. There will be, I think, some teachings that we're associating doing. And when we do have a public opening, once that gets scheduled, I'll be happy to share it with the mailing list or on my Facebook page or something like that. So, but you're all very welcome to come. And please reach out and email too. And I see another hand. Yes. My grant collaborator.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful work. It's really exciting to see it at this phase and at this stage. So, like the Lego kid in me, like, was really excited to see it, sort of the deconstruction of the building. But like the historian in me, like there's like two questions, right? One is, was it or was it not? And that is in part answered through the architecture, right? And so you almost have to deconstruct, as you were doing, the peeling back of the layers as it went, and that's just totally fascinating, to get to probably was not, right? And then that begs the second question. Well, if it was not, then why do we say that it is? And that is both a very local, specific question to sort of this building and this campus that is the answer to which I think is time specific, right? So it's the 1920s, you know, the Lantern article, then it's 57, then it's, you know, the surge in commemoration, which I don't think we'll be having anymore anytime soon. But then it's also, so that's sort of the local, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts. Just choose 1957. Like, what do you think? Why then do we see it being advertised? Or an article written about, right? And it's not like people are buying the Lantern, so it's something more to it there. So to get your thoughts on that, so the building back up. But then also, like the larger story, because this is Ohio, right? And so this doesn't, so certainly like Connecticut has it in these different places, but like Ohio has embraced like the Underground Railroad as its thing. It's the one thing that my students like know from 8th grade history, right? They're like, yeah, the Underground Railroad. And everybody wants to be a conductor. And it's like, nah, it didn't work that way. So like how much of this is like very specific to the kids who were here and the administration broadly defined? And how much of this is also just, it's Ohio, and we've decided that we want to be, like this is going to be where we're going to connect to slavery and African American history?
Yeah, thank you for that. I too have been thinking about what are the correlations with like 1957, 1923. I don't know. I don't know. I would love to think about that more with somebody to really flesh that out. Ohio. Why Ohio?
Would it be the Ohio River?
Yeah, that's a very big part of it. Absolutely, yeah. Because we bordered enslaved states. And then instead of, it was like the middle ground between this and that. But, I mean, Pennsylvania takes that on to an extent too, but it's more urban, and it's affiliated with more of the Black abolitionist community. Yeah, the Quakers. I mean, Siebert's work started because the kids were Quakers and they were bored in his history class, and he was like, hey, don't you know something about this? It's interesting though, the students, when I teach this, I ask them, what do they know about the Underground Railroad? None of them know anything about the Underground Railroad. Like, if you ask them, how did it work? Quiet. Which is, I think, also, everyone's heard of it, but when we start pushing on it and saying, like, well, how did it work? Well, then sometimes you get things like the North Star, and I worked with the city of Westerville and the Neighborhood Design Center to interpret the Sycamore Trail Park. And that design of it came, and the design of the park was done 10 years ago by nobody who was an historian, and it's just the North Star. It's like the drinking gourd. So everybody knows, but nobody knows. And I think that's where it's satisfying to dig into and start asking those bigger questions.
Karen Lewis, thank you so much. This was a fascinating talk, and
thank you all.
I hope everyone gets a chance to visit the exhibition at Thompson Library.
Thank you all for coming out on a Thursday night. Appreciate it. Thank you.